Um, Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Sloshower. Dr. Jordan Sloshower is a board-certified psychiatrist specializing in integrative approaches to mental health. Having completed his medical anthropology master's degree at the University of Edinburgh and psychiatric training at Yale, Dr. Sloshower possesses a foundation in conventional psychiatric and psychotherapeutic approaches. He brings a unique perspective and skill set to his work from prior training in anthropology and global health and deep interest in ethnobotany and alternative approaches to wellness, yoga, and meditation. For example, Dr. Sloshower's research and clinical interests focus on therapeutic applications of novel psychoactive substances, namely psilocybin, ayahuasca, and ketamine. Dr. Sloshower understands these medicines as acting on multiple levels of being, thereby possessing the potential for deep healing of root causes of distress and illness. He is a co-founder of the Yale Psychedelic Science Group and is currently an investigator and therapist in 2 clinical trials of psilocybin-assisted therapy in the treatment of major depressive disorder. He is also a clinical investigator in MAPS's expanded access program for MDMA-assisted therapy of PTSD. Once again, thank you for helping me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Sloshower.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. See if I can get a sense of, okay. It's always interesting presenting over Zoom. Nice to see some of your faces. Do some presentation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we can have some discussion. It's always the fun part. So we'll definitely welcome you all to come on video for that later discussion. And so with that, I'll, so much to present in a short period of time, but let's jump in here. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Mechanisms of Change in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies for Mental Disorders. And my objective in giving this talk is to kind of give a bit of an overview of how we think about, or at least how I think about psychedelic therapies as working. That's often, the hot topic in the field. How does this work? And we'll go through some different theories about that, from spanning the biological to the psychological, as well as some of the more spiritual mechanisms there. And hopefully this will serve as a bit of an overview of the field. So just to say a little bit more about myself, beyond the introduction. So I do come at this from a unique perspective, I think, having a background in social science and medical anthropology, as well as global health. I did my training here at Yale School of Medicine and my residency training here. Definitely have an eye towards social justice. And in that, having that background in anthropology, I really think of myself as in a role of knowledge translation, sort of being able to move between different fields. So between, the biomedical to the psychological and some of the sociocultural and anthropological perspectives, and try to bring those together. I do have a personal interest in Buddhist philosophy and meditation, as well as the indigenous and traditional and ceremonial uses of psychedelics, or plant medicines, as they're often referred to in those contexts. And my professional interest has, beyond the clinical trials that I've been working on, are largely in developing treatment models, thinking about policy, as well as education and training in psychedelic therapy and research. So when we're talking about psychedelics, this may be a review for some of you, where I'm mostly going to be speaking about the classical psychedelics, which are all structurally similar to serotonin in that they're 5-HT2A receptor agonists. And this class of classical psychedelics includes psilocybin or psilocin, which is found in psilocybin mushrooms, DMT, which is found in the brew known as ayahuasca, specifically in the leaves, the chacruna leaves. And it also includes LSD, which is derived from ergot, and as well as mescaline, which is in a slightly different class, but still 5-HT2A receptor, and that's found in, naturally occurs in certain cactus species, especially peyote and San Pedro cactus. So just very briefly, as some of you may know, that this field isn't actually new. I mean, beyond, and I'll touch on the antiquity of the use of these compounds amongst indigenous groups. There was a lot of science that happened in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s on these compounds. They were looked at in numerous conditions and for different purposes, and there was over 1,000 papers published. And then the research kind of disappeared, largely for political reasons and the scheduling of all these drugs as Schedule 1. And in the last 20 years, there's been a re-uptick in research on psychedelics. And this later period compared to the first period is notable for using increasingly rigorous clinical trial methodology, and certainly a lot of the advanced neuroscientific methods, cell biology, fMRI, all the fancy tools that we have now to try to understand how these molecules work, but also to give us a window into consciousness. So very active field right now. The work I'll be talking about and a lot of the research that's happened is focused on psilocybin, which, as I mentioned, naturally occurs in psilocybe mushroom species, which are widespread around the globe. There's a particular historical antiquity of ceremonial and religious use of psilocybin mushrooms. And just to give an idea, on the bottom left, those are images of a mushroom, what appears to be a mushroom shaman type of figure from, that's cave art in Algeria that dates back to about 7,000 years. And on the bottom right are more well-known mushroom statues found in Guatemala and other parts of Mesoamerica that are approximately 3,000 years old. And then fast forward several thousand years, then psilocybin's first isolated by Albert Hofmann in 1957, leading to a bunch of research on psilocybin at that time. More recently, there's been a number of studies, clinical studies, looking at the application of psilocybin in several different clinical conditions, especially anxiety and depression in cancer patients, a small study in OCD, more robust studies in substance use disorders, especially alcohol use disorder, and treatment refractory depression, as well as now general major depressive disorder. There's also been quite a bit of non-clinical research on psilocybin looking at its effects, again, from neuroscience perspectives, but also from social psychology standpoints, looking at its effects, on relatedness, on criminal recidivism, on nature connectedness, on just on mindfulness, on a whole different range of constructs. I will just mention this MDMA research, which is not it's not a classical psychedelic drug, but does have psychedelic properties. And I'll just mention this because you may be hearing about this in the news, and it's likely to be the first drug with psychedelic properties that's shifted from Schedule 1 into a medicalized model. And there's phase 3 trials underway right now using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for refractory PTSD, and MDMA has also been studied in a few other conditions, but PTSD has been the main one, and this is likely to be approved in the next 2 to 3 years. So now we'll jump into the part on mechanisms of change to think about how these drugs, especially when combined with psychotherapy, how are they working? And here's a cute cartoon that was drawn during one of my lectures at a conference this year, depicting little mushrooms just chipping away at someone's depression. All right, so when I discuss mechanisms of change, I like to start off with this slide talking about different discourses for understanding psychedelic effects. And this is to say that we can look, what's particularly fascinating and I think unique about psychedelic research and psychedelics is that we can really look at their actions as affecting different systems or different modes of being as humans. And in particular, we can consider their neurobiological impacts, and this reflects, and each of these levels sort of reflects different names that currently exist for the same group of compounds. So, we can refer to them as serotonin 2A agonists or psychoplastogens, which refer to their effects on neuroplasticity, which I'll get into. We can look at their psychological and emotional effects, the actual subjective experience, and that was where the term psychedelic came from, meaning mind manifesting. Some people consider them, to be a cognitive tool, like you'll hear in some of the research on end-of-life applications, that this would be a useful tool to have in the tool belt of dealing with existential distress. We can also consider their impacts at a more social or ecological level, because there's a whole discourse around psychedelics as enhancers of connection, both interpersonal connection, but connectedness between people and their environments. Some of these drugs are considered empathogens, especially MDMA, meaning that eliciting that sense of empathy and connection. And lastly, we can also consider their spiritual and mystical effects, which of course harken back to their original uses in ceremony. And this reflects the term entheogen, which means producing God within. And of course, these compounds still have religious uses today, reflecting that. So how does this all tie together? And that's really what I've been interested in, is not necessarily separating these out, but really tying them together, seeing how does one level of analysis or one discourse inform another. And can we actually bring these together? If we're looking at, as a clinician, is how I'm approaching it, if we can actually look at our patients and think about how these medicines might work on all these different levels and actually try to maximize those potentials, then I think we're likely to have a greater impact, especially an idea of personalized medicine. Some people may be more resonating with a particular discourse and prefer to think about how they're acting in a given discourse, whereas another person, so one person may be more comfortable with the biomedical model and understanding, whereas someone else more psychologically oriented, and someone else may be coming to this with a more spiritual perspective. So I'm going to go through a couple of these different levels and just discuss some of the theories and what we know thus far in the field. And of course, this could take a lot longer than the time I have, but I'll do my best here. So as far as the neurobiological mechanisms, one of the main theories around these drugs is that they can promote structural and functional neuroplasticity. And the thought here, this is just a simple diagram, just basically showing how these compounds act on the serotonin 2A receptors, which downstream can increase glutamate release, as well as further serotonergic actions, basically converging on BDNF, and therefore leading to neuroplastic effect. And you can see here with the NMDA receptors that there may be some overlap with the mechanism of ketamine, which also acts in this through this mechanism. And similarly, we think has neuroplastic effects. There's been a few interesting studies further elucidating that hypothesis. This is one from Cell that showed that psychedelics promote dendritic arborization, and they looked at different classes of psychedelics of rodent neurons this is in vitro, and showed, compared to placebo or vehicle, increases in dendritic arborization amongst all the different classes. That was quite interesting. They found a similar result when they looked at the effects on dendritic spine growth or spinogenesis. Again, looking at 3 different classes of psychedelics, and showed, at least in vitro, that they had that effect on spinogenesis. And this also led to us developing a study at Yale that I've been working on for the last several years, entitled Psilocybin-Induced Neuroplasticity in the Treatment of Major Depressive Disorder, because no studies had actually looked at this in live humans. It had either been mostly in vitro or potentially in rats, and it's much harder to try to look at this in live humans. But the folks that I work with in the lab here at Yale have a task, an EEG task called long-term potentiation. I'll get into that in a little bit, that allows us to look at this in live humans, which is exciting. So this trial is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study of psilocybin therapy in patients with moderate to severe major depressive disorder. We're primarily looking at this EEG outcome on neuroplasticity, but also looking at psychological mechanisms, especially something called psychological flexibility. And that was in the context of an ACT-based or acceptance and commitment therapy-based protocol. And I do believe you guys read that paper to give you a little more on all of that piece of it. So as far as the LTP task, just to very briefly explain it to you, since I know many of you are either neuroscience majors or this is a neuroscience class. It's basically an auditory EEG task where you provide an auditory stimulus. You're measuring what's called an N100 signal, and you do that both before and after delivering this high frequency auditory tetanus. And then you can look at the difference in the N100 pre versus post the auditory tetanus. And it's basically, the tetanus is basically a learning paradigm to promote structural synaptic density, essentially, or how closely neurons will fire together after this tetanus. And so you look pre and post and look at this difference here. And if you see the difference like this, you could say that long-term potentiation was induced. And this is a very cellular form of neuroplasticity. And what we're doing in the study is actually conducting this paradigm both before and after patients receive different doses, either placebo, low dose, or a higher dose of psilocybin, with the hypothesis being that after the higher doses of psilocybin, we would see larger increases in long-term potentiation. And so our data is not fully in yet, and so I look forward to presenting those results. I think we'll see beyond just looking at the LTP, we're looking at a range of different EEG data to see how the brain responds to psilocybin in patients with depression. So hopefully I can come back in next year and present some of those results. One of the other main hypotheses on the neurobiological level relates to alterations in functional connectivity. And in particular, we talk about network disintegration and desegregation. And what we mean by that is that it's kind of demonstrated by this connectogram here that you see on the bottom left. And basically, what this shows is the patterns of communication between brain areas. And of course, around the rim, this is like areas that are closer geographically together, and then those that are further apart. And so, in the normal state or on placebo, you see a lot of communication within networks or within, local areas of the brain, and relatively little crosstalk across different networks or across different brain regions. But under psilocybin, you see that pattern completely breaks down. There's network disintegration, meaning less talk within networks and more crosstalk or desegregation. And so that's quite an interesting finding, and potentially relates to this idea of connectedness, and making insights in an altered state of consciousness that one may not normally make, as well as this process has been shown to correlate with some of the subjective experiences like ego dissolution. Another piece that also correlates with ego dissolution is the disruption of a particular brain network known as the default mode network. Some of you may have heard of this, gets a fair bit of attention. It's also gets discussed in the meditation literature, because you also see disruptions in the default mode network during meditation. And so the DMN is often thought of as a self-reflective network. When you're thinking about yourself or ruminating, you might see the default mode network quite active. And then when you're either in a meditative state or even just highly engaged in a task, you would see it more quiet. And you see that the default mode network sort of goes offline actually during the peak parts of psychedelic experiences, and this tends to correlate also with the experience of ego dissolution. All right, so I'm going to move on now to some of the more psychological or psychosocial mechanisms. And, really the one that's gotten a lot of discussion in the literature to date is the fact that psychedelics at moderate to high doses have shown in controlled settings with a lot of preparation and support have been shown to fairly reliably induce what's considered a mystical type experience, which has been operationalized into different domains of what that actually refers to. And I don't have time to get into all of that, but it's essentially a spiritual type of experience. And this is really where the so-called psychedelic renaissance began, is at Johns Hopkins, where they showed that you could actually reliably induce these mystical type experiences and under these controlled settings. And what this graph was actually showing is that in a dose-dependent manner amongst healthy volunteers, that as you go up in the dose of psilocybin, that the number of volunteers that actually rate these sessions as being even among the top 5 or single most spiritual experiences of their entire lives goes up to approximately 80%, which is quite something. People rating that these lab controlled kind of experiences amongst birth of their child, their marriages, etc. This is pretty profound potential impacts of these experiences. And so but I've been and just to say that they've also correlated the strength of the mystical type experiences to a whole range of clinical outcomes in the studies, and have pretty much across the board showed a correlation between the strength of the mystical type experience and the degree of clinical benefit. And that is held true in the research on substance use disorders and in depression and anxiety studies. Interestingly, here at Yale, we did conduct a study with lower dose psilocybin for headache disorders, and we did not see that correlation there, suggesting that at least for headache disorders, there may be more of a biological mechanism at play that's less dependent on the subjective experience. But even though I find this quite compelling, something I thought about, especially in the ACT paper that some of you read as well. The mystical type experience is really interesting, but how do you go from mystical type experience to clinical improvement? What are some of the mediators of that, or can we think about that in either a more psychosocial way? What does it mean to have a mystical type experience that people end up getting better? How does having a mystical type experience actually make a difference for people? And so some of these sort of more intermediate constructs have been looked at, like sense of connectedness, sense of nature relatedness, having had a sense of awe, or having had psychological insights, or having concrete behavior changes. So these are all things that are potentially at play in these therapies. And so, initially, even going back to the 50s and 60s, this was really the original paradigm of how these drugs were thought of in this psychotherapeutic, psychosocial context. So psychedelics were seen as enhancers of psychotherapeutic processes. So that's where this term psychedelic-assisted therapy comes from, is it was seen that these drug experiences could punctuate and potentiate a larger psychotherapeutic process. So it was less thought of as just a drug treatment, but actually, a larger psychotherapeutic approach. And then you put some psychedelic sessions into that larger framework to help boost or further the overall psychotherapeutic process. And so there's been, obviously the field is figuring out where on this spectrum really the treatment paradigms are going to be. Is it more of a biological intervention? And that's sort of the model ketamine's been in, and I'll get into this a little later. Or is it more going to be psychedelic-assisted therapy, where the therapy is a significant component? But at least in that paradigm, there's been several studies and approaches that are squarely in that psychotherapeutic paradigm and have come up with treatment manuals to address specific conditions. And so this is MAPS's protocol for the MDMA therapy, which is, again, a MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Michael Bogenschutz and his team at NYU developed a particular paradigm using psilocybin in the treatment of alcoholism. And they, again, paired psilocybin sessions with another evidence-based form of treatment for alcoholism that was more of a CBT kind of approach. And then this is the paper you read where we combine psilocybin sessions with acceptance and commitment therapy as a therapeutic frame to address depression. And again, how do we think about this process as taking place? Well, we can see that in a psychotherapeutic paradigm that these sessions with adequate preparation and support and in the context of therapy can lead to emotional breakthroughs. We've seen personality change scores, psychological flexibility, which we can touch on more, and that was in this paper, psychological insight, and resolution of trauma, past trauma, especially in the MDMA model, but I've certainly seen that in our psilocybin studies as well, although we're not directly addressing PTSD. Many people with chronic major depression do have some trauma histories, even if they're more of the smaller chronic traumas, but definitely that has come up in the course of therapy. All right, how are we doing on time here? Probably go for another 10 minutes. Okay, so just to touch a little more on psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy as a concept. So I pretty much described it. It's where you embed drug sessions within a larger course of psychotherapy. Essentially, the theory behind this is that we really value the actual experience of the drug effects. We don't think of it just as, take the drug and let the drug do its thing on your brain. We're really like engaging the participants in the process and really curious and interested in what takes place and what meaning they make out of the experience. We try to really control that experience a little bit, not necessarily control, but guide it through this concepts of set and setting, meaning set being the psychological mindset of the person having an impact on the actual experience, as well as the setting. And we know if you control the setting, make it comfortable, you're less likely to have anxiety-producing reactions. We learned that in the early phases of the research back in the 50s and 60s. And so this is just to give you a sense of our room at the VA. It's a hospital office, but we make it cozy with couch and have window and some plants and things like that to make it a comfortable environment. Because again, these sessions are quite long. They last 7 or 8 hours generally, so it's a long session. And pretty much all the studies of psychedelic therapy have used the same basic structure, which is to have preparation sessions before any drug sessions, and then to support people during the actual experience. Not so much different protocols do different amounts of therapy during the actual experience, but generally more of just supporting people to have their own internal experience. And then the integration process or follow-up psychotherapy afterwards to really debrief, find out how the session went, and draw all kinds of meanings and see how that, having had that drug experience, might impact their day-to-day life and the condition that is being addressed. So I think I'm going to skip over this, but just in the interest of time, but basically just to say that the psychedelic-assisted therapy model has some differences from a purely psychopharmacologic model, which I described as the typical ketamine model, where in this model you're essentially thinking mostly on the biological or neuroscientific level, that you just take the molecule, you let it do its work on the brain, it'll induce the neuroplasticity, and that's what you're going for. The experience isn't of central importance. It's kind of an epiphenomenon. Let's just keep it controlled and contained and hope that the drug does its thing and that we end up, reducing symptoms Whereas in the therapy model, it's more of a biopsychosocial approach. We're really engaging participants in the process. We're, I think, through the therapy and drug combination, really trying to get at underlying causes or patterns of behavior and thinking that lead to the disorder, as well as addressing traumas, which can certainly happen and be quite helpful for patients to move through that and have trauma resolution. And so in some ways, the outcomes are less predetermined in this model. I mean, of course, we hope that if it's a study for depression, that we address, depressive symptoms, but it may be that that other things take place, or people have a fuller range experience of life. They change their relationship to the symptoms. Maybe the symptoms don't go away, but they are not as burdened by the symptoms. And so it's a little bit more of a broader approach. I did have some qualitative reports that I continue to collect from our participants, just to give a sense of what people end up saying about the therapies. And they also reflect different, some of those different paradigms. Some of them think about, you can see traces of them thinking about it on the impacts on their brain. Some of them discuss much more of how it affected their past traumas. Some of them so here's just a few quotes. Participating in the study changed my life, and that it was the catalyst, the mechanism through which I was finally freed from a mental prison I had been trapped inside for over 2 decades. So this is from my study of major depressive disorder, most of which many of the patients have been suffering from depression for quite a long time. Here's another one. I've always felt that there was something very, very wrong with me, something fundamentally flawed. Intellectually, I've always known that is not true. But now I've been shown that it's just not true. I'm okay the way I am. It's okay. I've seen that it is possible to live like this. So that's more of a psychological shift that happened there. I've seen how I've been buoyed to my fears. I've been holding on to them for dear life, but I'm not holding on to them now. I've let go of the buoy. They're still within arm's length, but I've seen that there are other ways to exist in the world. I want to be around water, in the water. So this was related to a vision that the participant had during her session. Okay, I'm gonna skip this one a little longer. I could go on discussing this for a long time, but I do want to allow for questions. We can discuss safety during the discussion as well. Basically, it was interesting. Some people consider a controversial paper that David Nutt published out of the UK, but basically they came up with an algorithm to rank different substances, the harms both to the individual users as well as harm to others or society. And so there was quite a few different factors that went into each of these rating scales. And it basically just shows that a lot of debunks, our scheduling system, that it's largely, it doesn't really reflect science or public health. It's a lot more politically based in that, our so-called legal drugs like alcohol and tobacco are, up in the higher rank, and obviously alcohol scoring is clearly the highest, most harmful substance out of any of these. And basically just showing ketamine down here in the middle, which is being used for depression, and then MDMA, LSD, and mushrooms really much further down here on the lower end. That said, there definitely are safety concerns. These are not harmless substances. They're extremely potent, but they physiologically quite safe in that regard. No evidence of neurotoxicity, very low risk of abuse, certainly with the serotonergic hallucinogens, which haven't been shown, have been shown to have extremely limited reinforcing effects and no evidence of dependence, withdrawal, or compulsive drug seeking. But definitely potential harms, certainly more in the psychological realm when people aren't being screened properly, or the setting is not controlled. Certainly can be quite a lot of risks involved, including dangerous behaviors, people having a lot of psychological distress or bad trips. If people aren't screened well, but certainly there are cases of psychedelic use precipitating or exacerbating mental illness, underlying mental illness or psychotic disorders, risk of drug interactions, cardiovascular effects, or perceptual disturbances that last longer, though, at least in the case of that last one. That's never happened in the case of controlled studies. That seems to happen rarely out in the world. So just to wrap up, so some future directions for this line of research. So psilocybin was granted FDA breakthrough status for depression and treatment refractory depression, and larger registration trials are underway. MDMA is further ahead and is at least halfway through their phase 3 trials for PTSD. So that's likely to be the first one that makes it through the FDA process. There's also a number of psilocybin trials for substance use disorders that are either in process or just finished, especially one for quite a large study for alcohol use disorder that hasn't been published yet, but the results are promising from what I hear. And that's likely to go into a phase 3 trial and could be an FDA indication in the future for psilocybin. And then, right now is kind of a crazy time in the field. There's a ton of startups and commercialization happening. People seeing this is one of, the next big thing. A lot of people who are in the cannabis industry jumping into psychedelic medicine, which brings up quite a few concerns, some opportunities as well, clearly. So, a lot of people are already thinking to the next phases post FDA approval. How's this going to be scaled up? Training and education for therapists and researchers is something I've been interested in. And just to end on saying, that I do think a fair bit about the ethical issues facing the field. Certainly this summer, thinking a lot about the equity and social justice implications of psychedelic science, how white supremacy has and continues to function within psychedelic science. Again, keeping an eye on the commercialization and scale up process for psychedelic therapies, and really thinking how can we make psychedelic science a force for social justice, and considering diversity, equity, and inclusion, which it has been an issue in this field. And I can talk more about that in the discussion, but just to say that historically and recently, the majority of the participants in clinical trials have been white with very little diversity, and as well as the therapists and researchers also not having a large amount of diversity in that population. And this issue has been getting more and more attention, and been something I've been thinking a lot about with my colleagues. So I will end it there and open up for questions. Really appreciate that you all took the time to read the papers, and feel free to send me an email. We do have a psychedelic science group that holds seminars here at Yale that you could sign up for our mailing list at this website down here. And let's open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was just so fascinating. It's amazing. Thank you. So yeah, I'll just let you have one question in the chat, and otherwise I'll just let you field questions. Folks can raise their hands or just unmute themselves and speak.
Do you want to read the question, Sarah?
I'll do the one in the chat. Do you think it's possible to safeguard against cultural appropriation when trying to introduce psychedelics into mainstream medicine? How do you combat reductionism and prevent cultural psychedelics from becoming part of big pharma aimed at profit? So you sort of touched on that a little bit.
Is that in the chat? I was looking at the chat. I see a different question. Where did you see that question?
It was directly to me.
Okay, I was like, where is that?
Yeah, and then there is another one in the chat as well that I can read you after.
Okay, sure. Would you mind reading that question one more time?
Yeah, it's a little long. They're all a little long, I have to say. There's a bunch of them now, but they're all a little.
That's okay. Give me that first one again.
Do you think it's possible to safeguard against cultural appropriation when introducing psychedelics into mainstream medicine? How do you combat reductionism and prevent cultural psychedelics from becoming a part of big pharma used only for profit medicine?
Yeah, wow. whoever asked this is definitely tuned into the field, and it's such a great question. It's a huge question. I don't think I can do it justice. I can definitely share a few thoughts about it. Yeah, I mean, this is a major issue, on so many different levels. I mean, I think to some degree, yeah, there is cultural appropriation that's happening. I mean, these are medicines that were used initially in traditional and indigenous contexts, and they were isolated and, now being taken into a medical context and being brought into therapies. And, can that be done in a way where there's reciprocity? Think about biopiracy, which is a long trend of, Western researchers going into the rainforest or other contexts and just taking, traditional medicines or plant-based medicines and turning them into pharmaceuticals, patenting them and profiting. And all those profits just go to corporations, and, there's no equity or distribution in that. And so is that a risk of happening? Absolutely. And are there, folks who are watching the field and looking at certain entities, necessarily want to name names, but there are certain companies that seem more worrisome who are signaling when you look at how they're framing their operations to investors as, yes, they want to patent everything that they can possibly patent. And they have their shareholders. Obviously, they say they want good for the public, but where are the profits going to go? I mean, a lot of this needs to be looked at, and we need, this is one area where, politics is involved in science. I mean, we can't separate these things. So definitely a risk. I mean, definitely, as far as biological reductionism, I mean, I try to portray this in my lectures that we need to be thinking interdisciplinarily. We need collaborations across disciplines, and we need to be speaking with different practitioners. We need to involve indigenous people who've used these medicines for, many generations, in trying to not only a one-way, knowledge gain by us, like, oh, let's learn how they use these medicines so we can benefit more, but how can we engage in a reciprocal relationship with these communities such that, yes, we can learn from them, but there's also, we have to think financially, are any benefits going to go to those communities? And even, maybe we come up with approaches that are useful and will, we have to think about issues of access. Are communities of color, both in the United States and globally, going to be able to benefit from and access the therapies that are produced through all of this research? So a ton of difficult questions. And, we're functioning within a capitalist society where, the main model is a pharmaceutical approach. And so we're seeing, different players enter the psychedelic space right now. Some that seem to be adopting more of a traditional pharmaceutical approach, whereas others are more in a nonprofit approach. Some are just, much more tuned into the equity pieces of that. And so I think this is where, the nonprofits involved in the space, as well as the researchers and scientists, need to be, have their eyes open as to, what kind of science we're doing and what we're supporting, and bringing our values into it. I think, though many scientists are hesitant to engage in political discussions like this.
Yeah, thank you. So there's about 4 or 5 more questions in the chat, but so let me do a couple more of these, and then I see Sally has her hand up too. So Corinna, I don't know if you're still here, but how do you think the use of psychedelic drugs for therapeutic intervention will go in terms of acceptance? Do you think people will understand the benefits, or will it take a long time for society to acknowledge the benefits outweighing current negative attitudes towards hallucinogenic drugs?
So it's a great question. It's so hard to predict, honestly. I mean, it's been a pretty significant sea change in the last 5 years, I would say, with Michael Pollan's book and the mainstream media running a lot of mostly positive press about psychedelic research and therapy. So I think, there's been a huge cultural shift, I think, already in the last 5 years. But, will these be mainstream medicines? I think probably not. but it's hard to predict. I mean, I think it'll, you may see certain segments of the population gravitating to them. Either certainly what we've seen is people who've tried everything and nothing's worked, definitely being attracted to this, but also people who may not be as interested in pharmaceutical approaches, people more willing to do some of the more introspective work, who might be interested in this. Because again, I didn't cover this in the talk, but one of the main differences in this model is that there's no ongoing drug treatment. These are therapies where the drug is only administered a couple of times. And, so it's like maybe just a handful of drug sessions at most. Most of the studies are only 1 or 2 drug sessions. Of course, that's in a shorter time frame. I think in the real world, it may be punctuated every couple months, or it'll be that's a lot of research hasn't been done yet. So we'll have to see. And again, I think it's going to be interesting how they're framed, as just biological medicines that are taken, kind of the way ketamine's been framed, or is it more in the psychological framework? I think in the end, you'll see some kind of mix of these different molecules will likely be developed that have different durations of psychedelic effects. So it's going to be an interesting 20 years, that's for sure. I think a lot will be developed and changed in the next, even 5, 10, 20, in our lifetime. This will be quite an interesting field to watch.
Yeah. So there's still more in the chat. I'm going to switch to the people that are brave enough to speak in person, though. So
Yeah.
Professor Seraphin and then Adam David.
Okay, I'll try to be, can you hear me? I'll try to be quick. So first of all, thank you for a great talk. It's wonderful to see a fellow neuroanthropologist working in this area because of the importance of a, biopsychosocial, biocultural approach to these questions. So my first question is really quick, and it's whether or not there's sex differences in the psychiatric benefits or response to hallucinogens. I noticed that the anecdotes you used came from female subjects. And the second question was prompted by the Nut paper you shared. It evoked the recent controversy around Columbia neuroscientist Carl Hart, who is a proponent of heroin use. And I wondered at the time whether or not the negative reaction to this had to do with the sort of cultural legacy of heroin in the US being linked to escaping diseases of despair that are rooted in structural inequality, or whether it had to do with the opportunities for abuse based on, for instance, the rewarding attributes of dopamine antagonists as opposed to drugs that target other monoamine systems.
It's a good question. So the first part of your question was around, what was the first part again?
Sex differences.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I honestly have no data to draw on to answer that question. I haven't seen any analyses I haven't seen any discussion that there are gender differences, but I also don't know how much that's been looked at in the studies to date. So definitely a really good question. I haven't seen anything that I haven't seen anything so far in the literature that points to gender differences, but that, again, I'm not sure that it's been looked at adequately. I don't think it has. As far as the second piece, yeah, I think, it's hard really to comment on that whole controversy. I mean, what I could say is that there's a debate about something called psychedelic exceptionalism, which is, some advocates for psychedelics try to portray them, pointing at like the Nut paper, say, psychedelics are not like other drugs of abuse in that they aren't really drugs of abuse. They're not addictive. They have a much better safety profile, and try to, and I think there's some merit to this argument that there's really no reason why they should be Schedule I drugs. They don't really meet that criteria, and they're just not harmful enough to be in that schedule. At the same time, it ignore, that whole argument. I think what Carl Hart is pointing to is the historical legacy behind drug scheduling and the stigma that affects certain drugs but not others, and that there was so much politics and racism that went into drug scheduling, as well as criminalization and penalties of certain drugs versus others, that it's, to some degree, not that helpful necessarily to separate the psychedelics from something like heroin. And he's actually pointing to a lot of data that shows that it's really the psychosocial context that primarily determines whether a drug is addictive. I mean, yes, there are certain biological and the dopaminergic pieces that make some drugs have a higher addictive potential, but that really things like the social determinants are often what actually are the larger determinants of addiction and really need to be addressed. And he's, promoting, I don't know that he's saying like proponent of, heroin use, but certainly saying that I think he's a proponent of decriminalization and moving away from that criminalization paradigm. So, and trying to break down the distinctions between different drugs and just saying, people use drugs. This shouldn't be a crime. We should bring it into a treatment paradigm. Most people who use drugs actually do so responsibly and don't have the negative consequences. And for those who do, we need to bring them into treatment.
Great. So
great question. Sorry, I hope I did it justice.
That's good.
No, that was great. Thank you.
So Adam, David, and then Noah Glantz.
Yeah. Hi, Jordan. I'm a clinical psychology PhD student at UConn. So happy to hop in and hear the talk. I was curious, in your study, I looked at the description of the medication session. And I'm just curious if there's any more detail you'd want to provide about what's happening throughout the day in terms of the amount that the therapist is interacting with the client, the amount that they're just watching, the amount that, I mean, it seems like there's certain ACT-related criteria that they're trying to detect, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you about what that's like. And then the only other thing I was also curious about was, I know some people are also researching cannabis use for similar things like PTSD and other stuff. I was just curious if you knew, like we just talked about like the heroin controversy, but I'm curious if you know how the cannabis research is kind of fitting into or existing in relation to the psychedelic research.
Yeah, good questions. I know we're short on time, so I'll try to keep it brief. As far as the way the dosing sessions work, it's quite variable, I would say, and it's different between different study protocols. So it's really an interesting, because we don't have any clear evidence to point to one approach being necessarily the best or better than any other approach. I think, and there's been some differences in how the MDMA studies are done versus the psilocybin studies. The general way that the psilocybin studies are done is with a general instruction towards patients or participants having a more internal or inward directed experience. So that's, and for the purposes of in a controlled trial, I do try to give that instruction after people take the medication, 15, 20 minutes later, encourage them to lay back, be with the music. They have headphones, there's music in the room, and that we're myself, or there's usually two therapists or one therapist and a physician in the room. And, we're there to support them. In practicality, because we're using different dose conditions and the placebo sessions can be different than the high drug sessions. And there's so much participant variability. So, some sessions have a lot more communication with the therapist than others. Some people just really lay there and have their own experience. So it's really every dosing session, has been completely unique. I think we're just, what we try to be consistent is as the approach as a therapist, we're there 100% to support people in whatever they need to be comfortable. We generally aren't trying to do a lot of ACT or real psychotherapy really during the session. We try to say, if there's anything that the patients want to share with us, that is encouraged and that's great. But as far as really processing it to a high degree, I generally prefer to do it later. And then we're going to have tons of time later to really get into the nitty gritty of it. Share with us what's happening. If you want to discuss anything, we're there for you. Otherwise, let's just take a note of what was coming up for you and we'll discuss it later. That's kind of the general approach. And what was the second piece? Oh, the cannabis piece. You know, I don't have a lot to say about that. I'd probably take other questions. Honestly, there hasn't really been any evidence that cannabis use. That cannabis is helpful for psychiatric conditions thus far. Part of that may be that, and certainly I can say that I don't think set and setting have been considered in cannabis use. It's thus far been more of a biological paradigm, like looking at either lab studies, but there was one like more naturalistic cannabis study for PTSD that didn't really show any effects. So far, yeah, I don't have too much more to say about it. I haven't seen a huge interaction in the fields, which may be an issue. And I think there is more room for considering set and setting and potentially bringing cannabis more into the paradigm of like a cannabis-assisted psychotherapy. That is something people haven't talked a lot about, but is an interesting possibility.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is a generalization or if this is there's a reason for it, but it seems like much of MAPS's research has been focused on MDMA, and Hopkins has made a lot of progress, mostly with psilocybin. I was wondering why other psychedelics like ayahuasca or others haven't had as much attention or made as much headway through trials with the FDA or other studies.
Yeah, good question. A lot of it, some of it has to do with history, some of it history and politics, some of it has to do with pharmacology and the way that the FDA works. So ayahuasca in particular is a really complex brew that contains numerous different alkaloids, and it would be very difficult to standardize. And for the FDA purpose, you'd have, at least if you want to use a botanical form, and there has been a study like in Brazil, there was one study where they got a batch of ayahuasca, they did all the chemical analysis and said, this is what we're going to be testing, and it has this % of each tryptamine, and they characterized it. But of course, that would be hard to roll, then standardize and roll out. There also is a lot of like cultural reasons, and we talked about cultural appropriation. Ayahuasca still has like a lot of rich culture around it, and there's a lot of strong feelings about, oh, you're going to take, an indigenous medicine that is squarely rooted in a ceremonial framework and then just plop it into a biomedical model. What does that mean to do that? Is it just the pharmacology, or is it pharmacology plus all the ceremony and other elements that go into the set and setting in other contexts that lead to healing? So it's, again, just one of the challenges with this whole field of research is, is it a drug? Is it drug therapy, or is it drug plus set and setting plus, and is the set and settings that we're creating for the studies, certainly aren't the same as those in the ritualistic context. So what is the active ingredient here, and in combination? So it's pretty difficult to, so there's more challenges with something like ayahuasca. I think part of it too with psilocybin being the molecule of choice is that it didn't have the cultural baggage of LSD. And also it has kind of a good duration of action at about 6 hours, which makes it more manageable in clinical settings compared to LSD being more like 10 hours, or mescaline also being longer, like 10 hours. So, but a lot of companies now are looking at other molecules like DMT or 5-MeO DMT, which have much shorter durations, and again are easier from a pharmaceutical standpoint because it's just one active ingredient.
Are you up for a few more questions from the chat?
I'm good, yeah.
You're good, okay. Are the positive effects of psychedelic treatment dose related? Do you know of any experiments that have looked at positive or negative effects of increased dosage?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's still a lot of room for research here. As I kind of pointed out before, that for most of the psychiatric indications, there's been this correlation between mystical type experience and the clinical benefits, and then there's a correlation between dose and the strength of the mystical type experience. So the thought has been that in the medium to high dose, the doses that more reliably produce mystical type experiences seem to be more likely to have the clinical benefits. But again, I think that hasn't been rigorously tested. And here I did point to the headache studies that actually used like a lower dose, about half of what's used in the depression doses, and found significant clinical benefits in headache disorders. Again, that's been more in a biological paradigm where the experience it doesn't seem to be as important potentially. But in depression, yeah, I think we still need to look at different doses, but so far this trend has been towards the medium to higher doses, and things like microdosing, which is a big cultural phenomenon, has totally been understudied, or I would say understudied. Probably there's some more studies coming online, but we really don't know, do smaller doses over longer periods of time, could they help? That's part of the reason we included a low dose in our study to look at, can you get some of the neuroplastic changes with lower, either subperceptual or just barely perceptual kinds of doses? So I think it's still an open question.
Oh, that's really interesting. All right. Do therapists who work in this field, are they required to have their own psychedelic experience prior to using it with a patient?
Yeah, they're definitely not required to have it. And there's, pretty, I guess there's some debate in the field as to whether that, I don't think anyone's saying it should be absolutely required. I think a lot of people think that it's helpful, and MAPS did provide initially an opportunity for their therapists to receive their own MDMA therapy in a legal context. I think it would be, again, something that it would be great if it was offered legally in the context of a training opportunity for those who were interested in pursuing that. One analogy that some people use that I think is somewhat relevant is like, if you were going scuba diving, would you want to go scuba diving with someone who had never gone scuba diving before? Or would you rather go scuba diving with someone who's done that before and sort of knows the terrain and the waters? And so maybe not a perfect analogy, but some reason to think that it could be useful. But others feel like, if they've had a meditation practice, or again, I think just being a compassionate therapist and having clinical experience is certainly the most important when you're working with, say, someone who has a moderate to severe mental illness. So, again, no one's asked that question from an empirical standpoint to actually compare therapists who've had versus not to see if there's different outcomes. That would be an interesting question. But yeah, so good question.
Elena and Vivian, it looks like you're still here. Do you want to ask your question or have me read from the chat? Elena, do you want to just ask?
Sure. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really insightful. You posed one question at the end that I thought was really interesting, which was, how can psychedelic science be a force for social justice? And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about whether that force would come primarily from a shift in political discourse about these substances, or primarily in a shift of attitudes within the medical field towards these substances.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think potentially both. I just think that we need to have an equity lens as the research goes forward. I don't want to, there's some narratives of, I definitely am not endorsing like psychedelics can save the world kind of extreme narratives. I think, again, it gives us an opportunity in this field to look at drug development through a different paradigm, actually recognizing the historical roots of where these medicines came from. Can we envision how this would look if it were done in an equitable way, where the benefits are distributed, where the historical roots are actually honored and not just, pushed aside. And yeah, I mean, I think we need to continue to look at these different paradigms, biological, psychosocial, try to understand how do these treatments work, and can there be a useful shift in thinking about mental illness and its treatment through a different paradigm that's like through this paradigm of psychedelic-assisted therapy is really a true biopsychosocial model, really combining the best of all these different worlds of combining pharmacology with psychological process, and potentially, continuing with the social science research that looks at, I mentioned at the beginning, are there applications for these drugs outside of psychiatry, looking at picking up on research around criminal recidivism and in the world of education and criminal justice reform. So there's other potential applications outside of medicine as well that at this point are understudied. And I think, the medical side is going to lead the way. And part of when I talk about social justice, I'm also talking about drug policy reform and reversing some of the problematic practices around drug criminalization, especially the racist paradigm of drug criminalization that currently exists. So this research may be able to overturn that as some of these substances move out of Schedule 1 and rethinking, what actually, I think this is all happening within the context of a broader discussion around drug policy as well. So yeah, thanks for the question.
So in the interest of time, I think maybe just one last quick, one person in the chat is saying, in your recent study, you used ACT in conjunction with psilocybin therapy. Have you ever thought about combining something like meditation or mindfulness?
Yeah, so we actually do. I mean, we chose acceptance and commitment therapy, which it has a fair bit of mindfulness. I wouldn't say it has Buddhist meditation, but it has quite an emphasis on mindfulness built into the therapy. Again, we did a whole theoretical, kind of analysis amongst us to decide what we thought would make sense and wanted to just start testing, this model. I mean, there's definitely room for testing other models that either do or don't include mindfulness. And eventually, it'd be cool to run a trial where you actually controlled for the amount of mindfulness potentially before and after. There is some interesting research that was done by the Hopkins team specifically on meditation, and included some experienced meditators, and looked at their brain changes and their experience. So it's definitely an active field of research. We use mindfulness both as a useful tool to help people during the drug sessions, but also as part of their integration practice. So we think, this is a limited drug experience. If people had benefit from that altered state of consciousness, how can they find a way to sort of tap back into that a little bit as they move out with time in a way that doesn't involve, repeated drug sessions. And so it seems like mindfulness or a meditation practice or dance or there's so many different methods out there are potentially useful integration techniques, but certainly mindfulness seems like one of them.
Well, obviously the talk was fascinating and generated so many questions and people so interested to hear more, but I think you've been at it for over an hour, so I think we should end here and just thank you so much for such a great talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And you guys asked some really great questions. So.
All right, well, thank you. Oh, wait, you've got people thanking you in the chat.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks again. This was really great.
Do the Zoom version of milling around after the talk to ask a question?
Yes, you can Zoom mill. I'll stop the recording so I don't embarrass Professor